ground rules. We create the safe space where we know we're not going to be judged, where we're really there just to support each other's growth. So these touchstones, there's 3 of them especially that I really love that I noticed show up in the lives of leaders and in the circle. And they're, kind of poetic guidelines, which I think is also fun. The first one is called When the Going Gets Rough, Turn to Wonder. And this is sort of a ground rule for how do we stay curious? How do we not go into a mental argument while we're talking with somebody or start judging someone, but just wonder if the conversation starts to get sticky, like, I wonder what's making this person react in a certain way, or I wonder what it is in their life that's causing some discontent right now or some kind of a reaction. But then another question is, I wonder what my reaction teaches me about myself. So it really lets us set aside judgment to listen to each other. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. In fact, as you were talking, I was thinking about, a lot of my work is with leaders and leaders in all kinds of contexts and different ages. And I was just with a group of young people yesterday at one of our local high schools, and what was on their minds was equity and inclusion, and how do you have conversations that are difficult conversations to have with your peers about things that divide us. And that touchstone, turning to wonder, came to mind. And yes, so it makes perfect sense to me, Shelly.
Yeah, and I think just that turning to wonder almost gives you this visual idea, too, of letting wonder and curiosity be in the room with you. And I like to have metaphors that helps me learn, and when I can visualize that, that helps. Another really fun practice for me is one called no fixing, saving, advising, or correcting each other. And that one, the leaders who I've interviewed have said that one has changed the way they bring themselves to work so much, because as leaders, we're expected to always have the answer. Even as friends and mothers and siblings, we think we're helping each other when we like to give advice. But it can be so countercultural and liberating even to feel like I don't need to give this person advice. What I can do is help them tap into their own inner wisdom, and what a gift that is to somebody else.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there are 3 touchstones that you like to talk about. We talked about turning to wonder and no fixing and saving and that. Is there another one that you'd like to talk about as well?
Yes, because the first 2 really need to be paired with this third one, which is the practice of asking open, honest questions. And these are kind of questions that you couldn't possibly know the answer to. They're questions that help, again, tap into a person's inner knowing. We're helping somebody else tap into their inner resources. So what's a question that I could ask you that would generate more reflection and insight?
So that's a way, it sounds like, of also paying attention and listening. I find in my own work as a coach and as a consultant that people are really busy. Instead of listening to you, they are busy thinking about what their response is going to be. And so when they answer a question, it may not even be the question you asked. So that asking open, honest questions, I think, just for me, it helps people just stay grounded and present and listen more closely and deeply.
Exactly. And I think being present is, it's another touchstone as well. Be present as fully as possible. And when we can do that and recognize that we're all here with the rest of our life going on in the background, but when we can bring ourselves to that other conversation just fully in the moment, it takes practice, but it also creates more space for that deep kind of listening.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to ask you a question about your writing process. You talked about being a writer. You talked about the joy of writing. I can hear that in your voice as you talk about your book and being an artist. Can you just tell us a little bit, Shelly, about your process in creating the book, and also talk a little bit about your journey with the book thus far?
Well, I do love writing books, and I think it's just part of who I am. I can remember writing books and illustrating my own books in second grade. So I think writing books is just part of how I process life, process questions. Part of the process of this one was another favorite thing that I get to do is talking with other people, and I interviewed over 120 people for this book.
Oh my.
And so, my background is in journalism, and so asking questions to get to the story beneath it is something I really love to do. And then I love to weave together then the big ideas that go with the stories. An important part of my writing practice, though, is not just the interviewing, but it's writing by hand, doing my first drafts with a pen and paper in my journal, which I guess for me it feels like I'm tapping into another part of my brain, but I also feel like I'm having a conversation with myself that I can explore. I call them my case study days. In the midst of writing the book, I had my day job, so I was asking myself, on especially hard days, okay, what of these ideas that I'm writing about could I apply at work in this moment, as a way to test whether they really held water? And I was pleased to find that they did.
Wow, that's amazing that you interviewed so many people. Can you tell us a little bit about the 120 and like what were the big themes that drew you to these particular individuals? What were you looking for?
Well, for this book, I was trying to hone in on how people are working in organizations or working in community to change not just their personal life, but the way that they work with other people, and if that shifts the way that their organizations can serve their purpose or their mission. And so I started by talking to a lot of courage and renewal facilitators, many of whom are in the business world, and asking them also to connect me with people who had been through courage and renewal retreats. And I was looking for people who had been through more than one program to see if there was a shift over time in how deeply these practices showed up in people's lives. And a group down in California called the Courage to Lead for Nonprofit Leaders, I was able to travel there and saw and interviewed about 9 leaders plus a group, and they have this cumulative community where they've gone through retreats and then become part of an ongoing community. And I really saw the span of courage that can happen over time. I mean, some of them had been practicing for 10 years, but that sense of going from physical courage to collaborating together seemed to show up. One of the things that I feel like I saw from the stories is that it really is true that when people tap into who they are deep inside and lead from that place rather than leading from who they think other people expect them to be, they're tapping into their gifts. They're tapping also into what their values are and what brings them meaning. That there's something that seems like it clicks into place, and suddenly their organization seems to take off in a stronger way as well. So that was affirming and surprising almost at the same time.
Wow. As I listen to you talk, you're making more transparent, if you will, the kind of work that I do and love to do. And I don't think about it in the same language necessarily, but it's just fascinating to hear you talk about this. And I want to just ask you another question. You've used the term Center for Courage and Renewal several times. That's obviously a place where you work. Could you tell our listeners what that means so that they get a little bit more robust idea of what that center does and what the word Center for Courage and Renewal actually mean for you?
Sure. Well, we are both a small nonprofit organization, a 501c3. That means we're tackling problems that don't have an instant answer, but our primary product is to train facilitators who can then use this social technology called the Circle of Trust approach in their lives and in their work. So in a way, we say it's about the content and the books and the ideas. We're providing resources for people through our website, but our facilitators are really the ones who create the programs then that people can attend, whether that's through coaching or through organizational consulting or weekend retreats where people have time and space to get away from work. The idea of courage and renewal, though, is also, we would say, a social movement, because it's about social justice ideas. It's about renewal not only of your own energy and commitment and passion for the work that you do, but that when people tap into that, there seems to be a renewal of energy and a renewal of the organizations and institutions they work in. So we sort of measure courage on this spectrum of renewal, from the personal to the collective.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? It's one of the hardest things to describe.
Yeah, it is, and thank you for saying that. I was actually thinking about the spectrum of individual to collective work, and that the work begins perhaps with the individual in terms of the courage work, but how that can spread within the practice, as well as how you take it out and apply it in the organizations, communities, whatever arena of practice you happen to be involved in. So it makes very good sense to me. Thank you.
Sure.
So I'm going to go back to a question that I asked you before. I kind of knitted two questions together, but I would like to hear a little bit more about this one, and that is the building up of courage. We talk a lot about courageousness in our culture, and braveness and boldness and daring and all of that, but a lot of people, I'm going to say, they kind of back away from that. I know when I wrote a book about 10 years ago called Dare to Wear Your Soul on the Outside, people would say, "Oh my goodness, doesn't that hurt?" And what I would say to them is the alternative hurts a whole lot more when you don't step up and when you keep your voice tamped down. And so can you talk to us a little bit more, Shelly, about what does it take to build up your courage, especially in today's world?
Well, I love that you said voice just now, because I think another thing I learned in this book is the concept of voice and agency feels like code word for courage. And we are starting to see more voice and agency. I mean, just think about the young teenagers from Parkland who had the horrible shooting happen. But rather than become victims or look to other people to help save them, they banded together and found their voices and actually started shifting a conversation that went not only national but global. And we have to think of, how do we sustain that kind of amazing courage to speak up? And I think there's some clues in what we see in movements like that I want to name. If we had a camera going on and I had a pen, I would take a pen and write these things on my 5 fingers, because I feel like I'm thinking of them as my courage quintessentials. These are the 5 things I think it boils down to, and how we create our courage. And the first one that I would write on my index finger would be true self. And by true self, I mean, how do we tap into that inner wisdom, that best part of ourselves in our heart, the person, the soul or the spirit of who we are. We might change as human beings, but there's still some essence of ourself that is our deepest wisdom. And courage, I think, is when we meet that true self. Those moments of courage that come out of the blue, maybe the physical courage or that sense of that thing, I can't not do this, I just have to do it. I think that's when we're meeting our soul. I think that's when our soul shows up. The second piece that I think it takes to create courage is trust. And the most important thing, so I'd be writing this on my middle finger, is we got to trust that true self. We have to learn how to trust our inner wisdom and our inner knowing. But the third one is that we need, on my finger I would write community. And by community, I mean we need to be able to trust in other people and build trust up. And when we have other people who can help support our growth as people, then we have a sense of we're in it together. I'm not alone. We can overcome isolation if we can have even one person. I mean, by community, I don't necessarily mean the neighborhood you live in or a large group of people. Community can be one other person who loves me enough and who I love enough to help each other grow. Those are the 3 main things that it takes to start growing your courage, but it also takes 2 key practices. And on my pinky, I would write the word paradox. And it's funny to think about paradox as a practice, but I really discovered this in writing the book. is that the leaders I interviewed had a capacity to overcome that sense of either or, black and white, polarized tensions, and they had a way of seeing it as a both and.